This insane 1,600 horsepower outboard engine setup will change how you see speed forever. 1,600 horsepower hanging off the back of a boat sounds like a typo. It isn't. Two Mercury V12 outboards, bolted side by side, add up to exactly that number, and what it actually does on the water is stranger than the number itself. Let's start with the single engine, because you need to understand the base before the math makes any sense. In February of 2021, Mercury released the Verado 600. 7.6 liters, 12 cylinders, 600 horsepower from one outboard, which at the time was more power than anyone had ever fit into a single unit hanging off a transom. The engine alone weighs about 1,260 pounds, roughly the weight of a small car, bolted entirely outside the hull. Most boaters spent years assuming 450 horsepower was about as far as an outboard could realistically go. The Verado 600 didn't just push past that number, it rewrote what the ceiling even was. Now put two of them on one boat. That's where this gets interesting, because the math isn't just 600 plus 600. Mercury's testing showed that two Verado 600 engines on a 46-foot boat hit 75 miles per hour and went from 0 to 20 miles per hour in 4.8 seconds. Picture that for a second. A boat the size of a small bus, fully loaded with fuel and gear, accelerating faster than most sports cars manage on dry pavement. Except this is happening on open water, with waves working against every part of that acceleration. To really understand what 1,600 horsepower means, it helps to compare it to things outside of boating entirely. A typical family sedan makes somewhere around 200 horsepower. A high-performance sports car, the kind built specifically to be fast, usually lands somewhere between 400 and 600. 1,600 horsepower is more than 2.5 of those sports cars combined, except instead of four wheels gripping pavement, it's two propellers fighting against open water, wind, and waves all at once. That's part of why the acceleration feels so different from anything on land. There's no traction the way a tire has traction. Every bit of that power has to fight through water that's actively pushing back. And here's the part that genuinely surprised engineers who tested it. Two of these 600 horsepower engines burned 20% less fuel than three smaller 425 horsepower outboards while going faster. That's not supposed to happen. More speed almost always means more fuel burned, not less. The explanation comes down to weight and drag. Two big engines create less hull drag than three smaller ones spread across the transom, and the two-speed transmission inside each Verado 600 shifts into a fuel-saving gear once the boat's up on plane. So you're not just getting raw speed, you're getting speed that costs less than the slower, more crowded alternative. The steering is where this setup stops feeling like a normal boat entirely. A standard outboard swings about 30 degrees when you turn the wheel. The Verado 600 swings 45, and it does it without moving the engine itself. Only the lower gear case rotates underwater, while the engine block stays completely still above it. With two of these mounted side by side, a single driver can run the whole setup with a joystick, spinning a boat that weighs several tons sideways into a tight slip with one hand. That's not a small convenience. That's the difference between needing a second person on the dock lines and parking a 1,600 horsepower boat solo. So why would anyone actually need this much power on a recreational boat? The honest answer is most people don't, and that's worth saying directly. A 46-foot center console can run perfectly well on far less than 1,600 horsepower. But the buyers chasing setups like this aren't optimizing for need. They're optimizing for time on the water. Offshore fishing tournaments often come down to who reaches the fishing grounds first, and an extra 10 or 15 miles per hour of cruising speed can mean arriving while the bite is still good, instead of after every other boat has already worked the spot. For tournament anglers, that speed difference is the entire competitive advantage, not a luxury. There's also a safety argument that doesn't get mentioned enough. A boat that can outrun bad weather has options a slower boat doesn't. Offshore conditions can shift fast, and the ability to cover 30 or 40 miles in the time it takes, a slower boat to cover 20 can be the difference between getting caught in a building storm and getting back to the marina ahead of it. Powerful doesn't automatically mean reckless. In the right hands, it means more margin. Now, 1600 horsepower isn't actually the ceiling either, and this is where the numbers start to feel a little unreal. Boat builders have mounted up to 6 Verito 600s on a single hull, which puts 3,600 horsepower on one transom. At that point, you're not really talking about a recreational boat anymore in the way most people think of one. You're talking about center consoles in the 65 to 70-foot range, built specifically to carry that kind of weight and convert it into speed. That sounds more like an apples-to-apples comparison with a light aircraft than with a typical fishing boat. The cost scales just as fast as the horsepower does. A single Verito 600 sells for somewhere around $80,000 before installation, rigging, and the custom transom work needed to mount something this heavy. 2 of them puts you well into 6 figures before the boat itself is factored in. 6 of them, the kind of setup you'd find on the largest center consoles being built today, means spending more on engines alone than most people spend on a house. This is not a budget upgrade. It's a different category of boating entirely, aimed at buyers who measure cost in a completely different way than the average weekend boater. What's worth remembering through all of this is that the underlying engine, the Verito 600, has been on the water for years now and has held up under real-world testing. This isn't a concept or a prototype stacked together for a headline. Builders are actually mounting these in pairs, quads, and now 6s on production boats that customers are buying and running offshore today. The horsepower numbers sound exaggerated until you realize every single one of them is something you could go see at a boat show this year. But owning a setup like this comes with a maintenance reality that doesn't show up in the headline numbers. 2 engines means 2 complete sets of scheduled service, 2 water pump impellers to replace on schedule, 2 sets of gear lube to change. Mercury recommends service intervals that are longer than a lot of older outboards needed, but on a twin V12 setup, even routine maintenance becomes a bigger job than most boaters are used to handling themselves. Most owners running this kind of horsepower rely on a dealer network rather than doing the work in their own driveway, partly because of the complexity and partly because lifting a 1,200-pound outboard isn't something most home garages are equipped to do safely. There's also the question of who actually gets to enjoy this kind of speed responsibly. 1,600 horsepower in open water, with good visibility and experienced hands behind the wheel, is a completely different situation than the same setup in a crowded channel or near swimmers. The acceleration numbers that sound exciting on paper are exactly why most marinas and waterways have speed limits close to shore. The power exists for open water, not for showing off in a no-wake zone. So would 1,600 horsepower actually change how you see speed on the water, or does it just sound impressive until you're the one paying the fuel bill? Let me know what you think in the comments and subscribe if you want to see what happens when builders push this even further.